Charles and Susie Thompson believed they had finally secured their sanctuary.
Richard Calloway had sent only photographs of the exterior, a facade draped in lush emerald vines that looked like a page from a storybook. Because they were unable to travel, they signed the deed and surrendered every penny of their life savings for a home they had never touched. But within the first week, reality struck. They hired a gardener to trim the overgrowth, and as the vines were pulled away, the entire front of the house gave way. The ivy hadn't been a decoration. It was a skeleton, the only thing holding the rotted walls upright. Charles and Susie stood in the ruins of their future and wept. They had no idea that the collapse of those walls was not the conclusion of their journey. It was the foundation of it. Hidden behind that debris was something Richard Calloway never noticed, something that had been waiting decades for the right people to arrive. If you believe that the darkest moments often hide the greatest light, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we share the stories that prove your life is never truly over. Now, let's begin. Charles Thompson had been paying for the right to exist under a roof since he was 22 years old. Every first of the month, he handed over his earnings. He was a man who understood that a family's safety was a debt that was never negotiable. Their first home was a basement studio on Elm Street in Hartwell. The pipes groaned in the winter. The neighbor's dog paced the floorboards above them all night. In 1967, $40 a month felt like a fortune on a starting wage from Kellerman Manufacturing. He and Suze moved in with a mattress on the floor, a card table, 2 folding chairs. They shared a quiet conviction that they were standing at the base of a mountain they would eventually climb. Life improved slowly. It changed the way it does for people who work hard and wait their turn. They found a larger apartment when Emma was born. Eventually, they graduated to a rented house with a yard where the children could ride bikes. They stayed there for 14 years. It felt like theirs until the landlord's son finished college and needed a place to live. They were forced to move again. This time, it was a third-floor walk-up. At 52, the stairs were a nuisance. At 68, they were a burden. Through every basement, every rental, and every flight of stairs, Charles and Susie shared a secret language. They were working toward the something. It wasn't just a building. It was a house with their names on the deed, a place where no one could ever knock on the door and tell them to leave. They spoke of it over lean dinners. They planned for it on long, late-night drives. It was the steady heartbeat beneath 40 years of labor, a dream they only dared to whisper about in the dark. Sunday mornings were for dreaming. Charles Thompson would slow the car to a crawl as they passed the houses they wanted. They didn't need words. They just looked. They saw the wide porches. They saw the manicured gardens. To them, looking was a form of planning. Every anniversary, the house was part of the math. They measured how far they had come. They calculated how much further they had to go. Susie Thompson kept the evidence in a manila folder. It lived in the second drawer of their bedroom desk. It wasn't a digital file. It was physical. It was real. Inside were 3 decades of longing. There was a stone cottage in Vermont. Susie had seen it in a magazine in 1994. She was in a dentist's waiting room. She tore the page out when no one was looking. There was a farmhouse in Tennessee from 2008. They had looked at it seriously. Then the financial crisis hit. The timing turned cruel. There was a house with roses on a trellis. Susie snapped a photo from the car in 2015. They were passing through on the way to visit Emma in Cincinnati. The folder grew thick with every quote won. For 30 years, They were the people who drove slowly. They were the ones who opened real estate listings and sighed. They closed the tabs because the money wasn't there. The moment hadn't arrived. But the folder was proof. It proved they never stopped believing. Susie thought of that folder as her most faithful companion. It held on to hope when her own strength failed. Charles Thompson stayed at Kellerman Manufacturing until he was 72. He worked 3 years longer than he planned. He needed the better pension. The house depended on it. Susie worked at the plant too. She spent years in the administrative offices. She tracked inventory and managed the records. She finally retired at 68. Her knees had turned the apartment stairs into a daily battle. She was 75 when the numbers finally aligned. They added the pension to the Social Security. They counted the modest savings from decades of discipline. They sold the contents of their rented life, the furniture, the good dishes, the extra car. It wasn't a fortune to the world, but it was every cent they owned. Charles sat at the kitchen table that evening. He looked across at Susie. A strange feeling washed over him. He wasn't at the house yet, but he was at the threshold. He had been walking toward this door for 53 years. In the dark years, he feared he would never reach it. He looked at his wife and spoke the truth. "We're going to do it," he said. He spoke in a low, steady voice. It was the tone of a man admitting a truth that had been waiting for him in the future for a long time. Susie reached across their small table. She placed her hand over his. Her face held that rare, raw gravity that appeared only when a moment carried too much weight for her usual calm. It was the same look he had seen on their wedding day. He saw it at the births of their children. He saw it when they stood by his mother's grave. It was a look reserved for the private, specific milestones that belonged only to them. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, underscore, to, underscore, underscore, she promised. They had spent 3 weeks scouring listings when they found Ivy Cottage. The link surfaced on a Tuesday morning in the first breath of spring. It was listed by an office in Millfield, a quiet town in Western Virginia. They had driven through it once, 15 years ago. Since that trip, Susie had mentioned Millfield more than once. She spoke of it as the kind of place where a person might actually want to wake up. The price sat right within their reach. The description spoke of original character and deep, established gardens. It promised the quiet dignity of a home that had served the community for generations. The photographs were striking. There were 11 of them, all bathed in the honeyed glow of the golden hour. In most frames, the house was a mystery. It was draped in a heavy, flowering curtain of green vines. It wasn't just a structure, it was a secret hidden in a garden. It looked like the heritage estates in English magazines. Where the wood was visible, it showed the silvered, honest wear of something that had stood its ground for a long time. At 9:15 that morning, Susie sent the link to Charles. Her message was short. This one. He called her back 4 minutes later. The realtor was a man named Richard Calloway. On the phone, he was exactly what a professional should be. He sounded knowledgeable. He sounded unhurried. He offered the kind of specific details that suggest true expertise. Richard spoke of the original construction and the thick vines that gave the home its name. He described the neighborhood as a real community. Then, with the casual authority of someone stating a simple fact, he mentioned the competition. There was significant interest. Several other parties were already moving toward a deal. In a market like this, a house with this much soul at this price point does not wait. Charles and Susie understood that pressure. They had spent their lives wanting things that more powerful people wanted too. They had lost apartments to faster applicants. They had watched homes they loved disappear because someone else had the money ready first. The fear of being too slow was an old, familiar ache. They asked when they could see the property. Richard explained that the sellers were currently abroad. The management was in a state of transition. A viewing would be complicated to arrange right away. He could perhaps set something up in a few weeks if they were willing to wait. But waiting a few weeks, he added, would almost certainly mean losing the house. They sat with that thought for 2 long evenings. They called their daughter Emma. She spoke with the careful, muted tone children use when they are trying to protect their parents from themselves.
Charles and Susie didn't listen. They studied those photographs until the pixels blurred. They memorized every word of the listing. On the 3rd evening, Charles dialed Richard Calloway. He made the offer. The paperwork was a digital maze. With Emma's help over a video call, they navigated it. By Friday morning, the money moved. By Friday afternoon, Ivy Cottage on Millfield Road belonged to them. When the confirmation email arrived, Susie wept. These weren't tears of joy. They were tears of exhaustion. For 53 years, the first of the month meant one thing: rent. For 5 decades, their shelter belonged to a stranger. Now, for the first time in their lives, the ground beneath them was theirs. They drove to Millfield on a Saturday in May. A moving truck followed behind. It carried the survivors of a lifetime of renting. Only the pieces with enough history to justify the cost were kept. Susie held the printed photos in her lap for the drive. Charles watched her. He felt a mix of tenderness and a quiet, gnawing worry. She knew those images by heart. The way the light hit the vines, the window frame peeking through the green, the stone path leading into a secret garden. She added them to her folder. It was her last entry in 30 years of dreaming. They reached Millfield Road at 11 in the morning. The street was silent. It was lined with old trees and houses that looked settled. These were homes for people who intended to stay. Charles nodded in approval. This was where he wanted his final years to unfold. "It should be this next one," Susie said. Charles slowed the car. The house stood there. It was like seeing a person you hadn't met in 20 years. The bones were the same, but the life lived since then told a different story. The vines were there, but they weren't a decoration. They were a shroud, a dense, suffocating growth that had spent decades unchecked. They climbed the facade. They strangled the roofline. They forced their way under the eaves like reaching fingers. Charles stopped the car. They sat in a heavy silence. The stone path was buried under a season of neglect. The garden was a chaotic tangle of weeds and shrubs. They had fought for space without human intervention for years. The front gate was orange with rust. It looked as if it hadn't been opened in an age. Susie whispered. Charles nodded slowly. He spoke with the cold precision of a man facing a hard truth. The engine went silent, leaving only the sound of their breathing. Charles Thompson stepped out of the car. The front gate groaned in protest when he forced it open. Beneath the wild overgrowth, the stone path was treacherous. Several stones had shifted, creating a surface that demanded his full attention. He smelled the neglect before he reached the threshold. It was a scent of damp earth and rot. It was the heavy smell of a house that had been sealed for far too long. Charles found the door hidden behind a thick curtain of vines. He took the key Richard Calloway had sent by courier. The lock turned. He pushed the door open into the dim interior. The vines had choked the windows, stealing the light. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the gloom.
What he saw confirmed the warning of the smell. A massive water stain dominated the ceiling like a dark bruise. It was the mark of years of leaks that no one had bothered to fix. Gray-black mold bloomed across the walls in intricate patterns. When he stepped onto the original wood floor, it felt wrong. The wood had been surrendered to moisture. It was soft under his boot, softer than any floor should ever be. He walked back outside to where Susie was standing on the path. __quote _7__, he said simply. Susie looked at his face. She had spent 53 years reading his expressions. She knew exactly what his careful tone was hiding. __quote _8__, she asked. He looked back at the house. The vines covered it so completely that he couldn't even see the condition of the walls. I don't know yet, he admitted. Let's go in together. That first week at Ivy Cottage was a lesson in reality. It was where long-held hope finally met the truth. But Charles Thompson was not a man who panicked. He had spent 50 years at Kellerman Manufacturing. In that world, problems were identified and addressed. They were not mourned. He brought that same systematic approach to the cottage. He started with what he could see and built his plan from there. By the end of the first week, he knew a great deal. None of it was good news. The roof had been abandoned to the elements years ago. The interior damage told a story of water entering and flowing wherever it pleased. On the third day, an electrician arrived. He used the measured, professional language of a man who didn't want to cause a fright. But his message was clear. The entire system had to be replaced. The house was not safe to live in. The plumbing was a network of multiple failures. In the basement, which Charles only discovered behind a kitchen door, there was standing water. Susie did what she had always done. She found a legal pad and began making lists. She worked methodically, without any drama. She categorized what they knew and what remained a mystery. The lists grew longer with every hour. Within 4 days, she had filled 3 full pages. On the evening of that 4th day, she sat alone at a small card table in the front room. Мебель все еще стояла в грузовике на улице. Чарльз Томпсон и Сузи решили подождать. Сначала нужно было понять, в каком состоянии полы. Сьюзи смотрела на исписанные страницы блокнота. Она вспомнила папку в ящике стола. 30 лет вырезок и распечатанных объявлений. Ее мечты, собранные по кусочкам. В эту минуту она позволила себе слабость. Она осознала всю пропасть. Расстояние между тем, что она представляла, и тем, что видела перед собой, потом она просто закрыла блокнот. Она зажгла походную плитку. Сузи Томпсон всю жизнь справлялась с трудностями. Она знала, как готовиться к любым обстоятельствам. Она принесла Чарльзу чай и села рядом, сказала она. Он посмотрел на нее. Она задумалась, ответила она. Чарльз замолчал, признал он. Кивнул он. Отрезала она. Он накрыл ее ладонь своей. Слов больше не требовалось. Утром 8-го дня приехали садовники. Чарльз нашел их по совету соседа. Хэролд Беннет жил через 2 дома. Он пришел еще во 2-й день с пирогом. У него был взгляд человека, который знает слишком много. Человек, который решает, стоит ли делиться правдой. Гарольду был 71 год. 30 лет на Милфилд-роуд. Он знал историю каждого здания, не из официальных бумаг, из памяти прожитых здесь лет. Рабочие прибыли в 8 утра. 2 мужчин с тяжелым инструментом. Им предстояло убрать вековые лианы. Они работали молча и профессионально. Они видели заброшенные места и раньше. Они не тратили время на комментарии. Чарльз объяснил план. Квоут 56. Бригада начала с левой стороны. Они методично двигались к центру. Чарльз и Сузи стояли в саду. Они просто наблюдали. Когда упал первый пласт зелени, стало ясно. Реальность хуже ожиданий. Дерево фасада впервые за долгие годы увидело свет. Чарльз вырос на производстве. Он сразу узнал разрушение материала. Бригадир сказал об этом тихо, почти шепотом. Лианы не просто росли на стенах, они проросли внутрь дома. Корни пронзили дерево и старый раствор. Растения стали структурной опорой этого здания. Когда рабочие сорвали центральную секцию, стена шевельнулась. Она не рухнула сразу, но она сдвинулась так, как сдвигается тело, когда из него вынимают кости. От самой крыши вниз поползла глубокая трещина. Бригадир поднял руку. Он приказал своим людям немедленно остановиться. The crew chief said. His voice was clinical, the sound of a man delivering a death sentence to a dream. Charles didn't blink. He just stared at the house, then at Susie. Under the vine they had just cleared, a yellow paper clung to the brick. It was official. It was old. It was a notice from the Millfield Building Department, dated 4 years ago. The words were cold. Uninhabitable. Structural deficiency. Condemned. Occupation prohibited. Charles saw the county seal. He saw the inspector's signature. He read it once, then again, as if the words might change. They didn't. He turned away, his knees giving out, and sank onto the cold, uneven stones of the garden path. He pressed his face into his palms and let the world go dark. Susie was there before he could even register the movement. She sat on the path beside him. She pulled him close, her arm a heavy, steady weight across his shoulders. They sat in the dirt and the pulled weeds while the crew chief kept a respectful distance. Through the gap in the green, the house stared back. The crack in the wall looked like a jagged scar. It looked like a final judgment. Everything they had was in this house. 53 years of rent checks, every dollar saved from the factory, the folder of 30 years of photographs, the hours Emma spent helping them navigate the online forms. The moment the confirmation email arrived, and Susie had wept with the sheer relief of finally being home. It all ended here, on this path, with this paper. Richard Calloway had taken their life's work and given them a ruin. Charles sobbed. He didn't try to stop it. He didn't apologize. He was 78 years old, and he had earned the right to break in his own garden. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the dream that had carried them through every move and every landlord's whim. It was the dream of the first of the month belonging to them, the dream of a deed with their names on it, a place that was theirs forever. Susie held him. She didn't say it would be okay. She didn't know. She just stayed with him the way she always had. But even through the grief, her mind was moving. It was calculating. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 12, underscore, underscore, she thought. At 11:15, the garden gate clicked. Harold Bennett appeared. He had been watching from his porch, gauging the exact moment they would need a witness. He was a small, neat man with silver hair and a look of absolute honesty. He had brought them a pie when they first arrived. He brought nothing now. He saw the notice. He saw the crack. He saw the two of them on the ground. He knew exactly what had happened. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 13, underscore, underscore, Harold muttered. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. Charles looked up, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 14, underscore, underscore. Harold eased himself onto the low stone wall. He moved with the slow caution of a man who was 71. He knew exactly how much his joints would protest the descent. Quote 15, quote, he admitted. Quote 16, quote. He took a breath. Quote 17, quote. Quote 18, quote. Susie said. The name felt heavy on her tongue. Harold's face shifted. A mask of grim confirmation settled over his features. Quote 19 __, he repeated. He spoke the name like a debt he had been expecting to collect. Quote 20 Quote 21 Charles said. There was no shame in his voice. It was only the sharp, dry acknowledgement of a truth that had cost them everything. Harold replied. The old man began to unravel the thread of the property's past. Ivy Cottage had been the work of William Harrove. He was an architect from the 1880s who had left his mark across the region. He died in 1931 with no one to carry on his name. For decades, the house passed from hand to hand. The last owner fled 4 years ago. They left in the middle of the night under a cloud of mystery. Without anyone to tend it, the county condemned the structure within 12 months. A single inspection had revealed the crumbling bones hidden behind neglected walls. Charles pressed. Harold said. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Quote 28 __. Charles and Susie exchanged a long, hollow look. They had pored over those pages. Emma had sat with them, trying to make sense of the dense language. Richard had been so helpful during the video call. He was reassuring as he explained every clause. He had turned a trap into a dream. Susie said. Her voice found a new, hard edge. Harold agreed. He used the word fraud without any drama. It was just a label for a fact. He stood up, his joints popping in the quiet garden. He looked at the house. He stared at the raw gap where the vines had been torn away. He looked at the cracks and the official notice. Charles answered. Harold turned his gaze back to the exposed facade. When Harrove built this place, he had a particular habit. He built for eternity. He didn't trust the world to keep his secrets safe. Instead of a bank, he hid his vital documents inside the house itself. He had read too many stories of fires taking everything a family owned. So he built a safe room. Not a room, really, but a hidden, secured cavity. He built them into the very heart of his buildings. He paused. Harold did not speak with certainty, only with the quiet conviction of a man who studied the forgotten. He knew the work of William Harrove. He knew that this crumbling interior wall was exactly where a secured space would hide. Susie looked at the ruin of the house, then back at him. She asked what he was implying. Harold spoke carefully. He suggested that before calling any lawyers, they should see what the wall was holding. They stepped into the darkness together. 3 figures guided by thin beams of light. They moved with the caution of those who know the floor can shift. The ceiling felt heavy. It seemed to be deciding whether to hold on or finally let go. Near the main entrance, the wall had surrendered. A jagged crack split the plaster from the molding to the floor. It was wide enough to reveal the hollow rib cage of the house. Harold tilted his light into the cavity and saw it. He stepped back so Charles could see. It was not a grand discovery. A dark metal box sat cradled in a bracket built into the framing. It was the size of a thick book. It had a handle and a keyhole, but no key. While the rest of Ivy Cottage had suffered from damp and rot, this space remained dry. The sealed wall had acted as a tomb. Charles reached in and gripped the handle. the box stayed firm. Harold noted it was likely bolted to the heavy bracket. Charles went to his car for his tools. He kept them there out of a lifetime habit of being useful. For 40 minutes, they fought against hardware that was over a century old. The bolts had no intention of cooperating. Charles worked with the patience of a man who had already seen enough damage. He knew that force would only break what was inside. At 12:40, the iron finally groaned and released its prize. They carried the weight to a folding card table in the front room. They set it down in the glow of a lantern. Susie sat across from the box. Charles stood over it. Harold stayed back at a respectful distance. He knew this moment was not his. The lock was a standard type. Charles recognized it from the old filing cabinets at Kellerman Manufacturing. He used a small toolkit from his car and worked the mechanism for 20 minutes. When it finally gave way, the sound was not a click. It was a long, metallic sigh. It was the sound of a secret breathing for the first time in 100 years. Inside, a bundle lay wrapped in protective oilskin. Charles unfolded the layers with steady hands. Susie moved to his side to watch. Beneath the wrap lay handwritten documents. The penmanship was elegant and deliberate. The writer knew these words would be read by people not yet born. Some pages had turned yellow with time. Others were on heavy stock and remained bright. Every word was perfectly legible. They were property deeds, dozens of them. Every single one bore the name of William Harrove. They covered land in Millfield and the entire surrounding region. Harold stepped closer. He read over their shoulders. He began naming the locations in a low, focused voice. He was a man of this soil. He understood exactly what he was seeing. Among the deeds lay a letter. It was dated 1928. That was 3 years before Harrove's death. Charles began to read it aloud. His voice was the only sound in the dim room besides the lantern's hiss in the May morning outside. Harrove wrote that he was alone. No children, no living family. He had spent his life building things and gathering land. He believed land was the only thing that didn't rot when you turned your back. He hid these papers in the house. He trusted good construction more than he trusted the banks. He wrote a final line, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 36, underscore, underscore. He meant the person with the patience to wait for the walls to speak. Susie covered her mouth with her hand. Charles set the paper down. Harold was still scanning the deeds. He said he knew these parcels. He had watched them for years. Some were sold, some were still empty. He looked at Charles and Susie. His voice was different now. It was heavy. He told them they needed a lawyer, not just to fight Richard Calloway. They needed one for this. Her name was Patricia Dale. Harold used her for his own affairs. He said she didn't waste a single breath. She arrived on a Thursday. She sat at a simple card table in the front room. She read the documents with the intensity of a surgeon. She read them twice. She took notes. She asked about the house's condition. She asked about the purchase. She asked every detail of their talks with Richard Calloway. Then she placed her pen on the table. She looked Charles in the eye. She told them they had a case. The condemnation notice was a public record. A realtor is legally bound to disclose it. It didn't matter that the sign was hidden by vines. Calloway knew it was there. He had an obligation to tell the truth. Then Charles asked about the Harrove papers. The lawyer paused. That was more complex. These were legitimate historical deeds. Whether they still held power depended on a search of every title. Some land might have been legally sold years ago. Others might still be empty. Without heirs, those lands usually went to the county. But there was a catch. They found these documents in a house they legally purchased. That created a rare legal question. It was a question of who truly has the right to claim what was hidden. Patricia did not waste words. The title searches began that same hour.
A fraud case against Richard Calloway was filed with the county. It reached the state real estate board by afternoon. Patricia knew cases like this. The evidence of non-disclosure was undeniable. It was a condemned notice hidden behind overgrown vines. It was a lie caught in the light. 3 weeks passed. Charles and Susie stayed in a short-term rental. Patricia had found it for them. Ivy Cottage was legally a shell, a place they could not inhabit. The alternative was a quiet retreat back to Ohio. But Charles refused. He was not going back. He was not ready to leave Millfield. He looked at the ruin on Millfield Road. It was a disaster. It was a structure the world had written off. But that falling wall had whispered a secret. It showed them a path that changed everything. Charles was 78 years old. He had been patient for 53 years. He was not finished. The results arrived on a Wednesday morning. Patricia called at 9. She was a woman who spoke before the world could get loud. She spoke for 12 minutes. Charles sat with his legal pad. He took notes in a careful shorthand. It was the same rhythm he used for 30 years at Kellerman Manufacturing. He recorded facts. He did not add emotion. Susie sat beside him. She was perfectly still. She did not just hear the words, she absorbed them. 11 parcels existed in the old deeds of William Harrove. 4 had been sold decades ago. They were gone. But 7 remained. 7 pieces of land had sat in silence for nearly 100 years. They were not abandoned. They were simply forgotten. No one was looking for them, so they stayed in the shadows. These 7 parcels had value. The appraiser was clear. In the current market, the worth was staggering. Patricia used the cautious language of an attorney. She did not want to offer false hope, but she could not ignore the truth. The legal battle would be slow. It would require the county and the courts. It would demand strength. Patricia looked at them with direct eyes. "I believe you have a legitimate path," she said, "and I believe we should walk it." Richard Calloway was served with a civil complaint that same Wednesday. He was under investigation now. The filing had pulled back the curtain on his history. He had done this to many others. But he would not have the chance to do it again. The construction began in September. It was a clear morning in early autumn. The air in Virginia was sharp. The work finally began. The air held a sharp edge, a silent promise of the coming change. To the west, the mountains stood clear and cold. Charles Thompson paused. Before entering the cottage with Tom, he took a moment to just look. They had found the builder through Harold Bennett. Harold knew every soul in Millfield who carried their weight. He vouched for Tom the same way he had for Patricia. No vague words, only specific reasons. Tom had worked these hills for 30 years. He moved like a man who had seen every complication and feared none. Charles and Tom walked the land together. Charles asked the questions of a man forged at Kellerman Manufacturing. He asked about load, materials, and the logic of the build. Tom answered with quiet respect. He saw a man who understood how physical systems functioned. Much of the old structure had to fall. This was the hardest part. Watching those walls crumble felt more final than any legal notice. But beneath the debris, the foundation held. William Harrove had built it to last. It was a foundation that did not need replacing. It only needed someone to build upon it.
They kept the stone path, fixing it inch by inch. Charles made one specific demand. They would keep the original oak door frame. It was wood from an era when things were made to endure. Tom set it into the new entrance. They saved the vines on the garden arch, too. Susie had asked for this. Charles understood without a word. Those vines were the start of their story. They would be there for the ending. The work took 4 months. Susie made every interior choice with the focus of 30 years of waiting. The kitchen window was set to trap the morning sun. The front room held the fireplace she had always pictured. The guest room was built for grandchildren. It had the window seat and the toy storage she had imagined. In the corner of the yard, Charles built a bench. He did the work himself. Tom offered advice, but the labor belonged to Charles. He placed it where the late light turns the world to gold. He was not a trained woodworker, but he had spent 50 years working with his hands. He knew the importance of a square corner. He knew how to make things solid. The bench was not perfect. An expert carpenter might have pointed out the flaws, but the bench was solid. It was his. It sat exactly where he envisioned it. When Susie sat there that first afternoon and declared it the finest seat she had ever known, he accepted her words as the gift they were. They finally moved in on a Thursday in January. The air was frigid and clear. To the west, the mountains stood sharp in that unique winter light, the kind Susie had only seen in the photographs she had collected for a lifetime. The moving truck arrived with their quality furniture, finally released from months of storage. Charles personally carried the box containing Susie's folder. It held 30 years of her life, torn magazine pages, old listings, and yellowed clippings. He placed it on the desk in her new reading room. She kept those papers not because the search continued, but because the longing had been part of her story. You don't discard the things that made you who you are. The legal resolution arrived in March, 4 months after they settled in. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning. She was a creature of habit, and Susie had learned that Tuesdays were for important news. The court had upheld their claim to 5 of the 7 Harrove parcels. 2 parcels were lost to technicalities regarding old claims from neighbors. Patricia had seen this coming and had tempered their expectations. But 5 parcels were theirs. When Charles heard the current market appraisal for that land, his legs went weak. He sat at their kitchen table. It was the same table they had used for 14 years in their rental. He looked at the deep scratches on the corner, the marks Emma made when she was 9, pushing her bicycle through the house. He stared out at the garden. Winter still gripped the earth, but a faint shimmer of green was rising where Susie Thompson had buried bulbs back in October. His mind drifted back to 1967. He saw their old studio on Elm Street. The pipes clattered in the cold, and the neighbor's dog paced the floorboards all night. Back then, $40 a month felt like a fortune on his entry-level wages. He remembered Susie at 22. She had a way of turning a cramped room into a sanctuary. He recalled coming home from the plant one afternoon to find a kitchen wall painted bright yellow. She hadn't waited for permission. She saw a dull space and chose to bring it to life. He thought of her folder, grown thick over 3 decades. He remembered that Tuesday morning in early spring when the listing for Ivy Cottage first flickered on the screen. Susie had sent it to him with a simple note. This one. Their darkest hour, the condemned signs, the crumbling walls, the garden path of broken promises, had led them here. It became the greatest financial blessing of their lives. The money wasn't the most important thing, but it wasn't nothing either. Richard Calloway had his license revoked.
The civil settlement was finalized, returning every dollar they had paid for the property, along with damages for what they had endured. The State Real Estate Commission's investigation finally bore fruit. They uncovered 3 other transactions where the same pattern of deception had been used. Patricia described the resulting criminal charges with the neutral satisfaction of a professional. She had done her job correctly. The truth was now a matter of public record. On a Saturday in April, the garden began to claim its space. It started tentatively. Then it grew with a quiet, certain confidence. Susie invited Harold Bennett for dinner that evening. She had intended to do this since the autumn. She waited until the urgency of the legal battle had faded. She needed space for simple acts of gratitude. Harold had been there at the very beginning. He was the one who walked over with a flashlight when the walls first groaned. He was the one who recognized the work of William Harrove. He had spoken up at exactly the right time. Such things deserved to be acknowledged with a meal at a proper table. They sat in the house that would not exist without his intervention. Susie prepared the meal herself in the kitchen with the morning light window. They ate at the good table and discussed the legal resolution. They talked about the plans for the land. 2 parcels would be donated to the Millfield Land Trust. They intended to hold the remaining 3. After dinner, Charles took Harold outside to see the arch. The vines along the left side of the property had returned with the spring. They responded to the training Susie had done in the fall. They climbed with the determination of living things that know their purpose. The arch was Tom's work. He had shaped it from the same stone used for the repaired path. He followed a design that Susie had sketched herself. It framed the garden entrance perfectly. It looked brand new, yet it felt as if it had always been there. Harold stood in silence and looked at it for a long moment. Charles watched him. "She insisted on keeping the vines," Charles said. "It was never a question for her." Harold nodded in understanding. Those vines had once covered the condemned notice that exposed the fraud. They had penetrated the walls and forced them to fall. That collapse had revealed the hidden box. The vines had been the disaster. They had also been the key to their salvation. Susie came out of the house carrying 3 cups of tea. She distributed them with the practical grace of a woman who has spent her life looking after people. She did it simply, without making a production of the effort. She stood beside Charles under the stone arch. The 3 of them looked at the garden in the soft April light. They saw the bulbs she had planted in October rising from the borders. They saw the bench Charles had built in the corner where the afternoon sun lingered. "You know what I kept thinking?" Susie asked. She was remembering those first days when the path was a ruin. "What?" Harold asked. "That it wasn't fair," she said. 53 years of life had passed. Every rent payment was made on time. Every move was forced because a landlord needed the space back. And then they were given this. She paused, looking at the stone. "But then I realized something. In all those years of renting, a roof never fell on us. We never had to worry about a foundation. We never saw a wall come down." She looked up at the arch she had envisioned. "If we had bought a house 20 years ago, it would have been the wrong one. We were finally ready for this one." Charles put his arm around her. They had paid rent for 53 years. The house they finally owned had required its walls to fall to show them its value. They had been cheated by a man whose greed was profound. That greed had accidentally led them to a treasure no amount of planning could have found. Charles and Susie Thompson came to Millfield looking for a sanctuary. They found a calling instead. They discovered a place to truly exist, a community to join, and a garden that needed their hands.
The vine-covered arch stood at the entrance, a gateway that would endure for decades. They walked through it together. If you have ever waited so long that the silence became part of your soul, if you have ever felt the earth collapse beneath a dream you carried for decades, if you have ever stood where every sacrifice seemed to lead to nothing, this story is for you. Charles and Susie Thompson did not find a perfect house. They found something much more powerful. They found evidence that the most painful arrivals often carry the most beautiful beginnings inside. You only need the grit to look closer. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that timing is not always an enemy. The home you were destined for was always waiting for the moment you were ready to receive it.
Some walls must crumble before you can see the truth they were hiding. We are truly grateful you walked this road with us today. We will see you in the next story.